The moment my father looked directly at me during his retirement speech and declared to 300 guests that he owed his success to his sons because his daughter never had what it takes, I felt something inside me shatter and rebuild simultaneously. 28 years of being overlooked, dismissed, and treated like a consolation prize crystallized into pure determination. As the applause thundered around me, I reached into my purse for the wrapped box I'd brought, knowing this would be the night everything changed between us forever. My name is Beth Harrison, and I'm the youngest of 3 children in what everyone considers a picture-perfect American family. Tonight, surrounded by crystal chandeliers and designer gowns at the grand ballroom of the Riverside Country Club, I watched my father, Robert Harrison, accept accolades for 35 years of leadership at Meridian Industries. The man commanding attention at the mahogany podium built his reputation on precision authority and an unwavering belief that success belonged to those who earned it through strength and determination. My brothers flanked our parents' table like bookends of accomplishment. Jake, 32, carried himself with the confidence of someone whose investment banking career had skyrocketed from the moment he graduated Harvard Business School. His wife, Sarah, sat beside him, her diamond tennis bracelet catching light as she applauded each mention of his name. Connor, 30, possessed the steady presence that made him one of the youngest cardiac surgeons at Metropolitan General Hospital. His girlfriend Amanda nodded approvingly as our father praised his dedication to saving lives. Then there was me seated at the far end of the family table wearing a midnight blue Armani suit that cost more than most people's monthly salary. I'd chosen the outfit carefully, hoping tonight might finally be the evening my father acknowledged what I'd achieved. At 28, I'd just made partner at Blackstone Morrison and Associates, one of the most prestigious law firms on the East Coast. Last month, I'd successfully negotiated a $50 million merger that had been featured on the front page of the Financial Times. But as I sat listening to my father's speech, I realized with devastating clarity that none of my accomplishments would ever matter to him. My mother, Linda, fidgeted with her pearl necklace, a nervous habit I'd watched develop over decades of managing my father's expectations and moods. Her silver hair was perfectly styled, her navy dress impeccably tailored. Yet she radiated the anxious energy of someone perpetually walking on eggshells. Throughout my childhood, she'd served as the family's emotional buffer, smoothing over my father's harsh criticisms and explaining away his favoritism with gentle suggestions that he simply expressed love differently than other fathers. The ballroom buzzed with conversation from Meridian Industries executives, longtime family friends, and community leaders who'd watched our family navigate the social circles of upper-middle-class suburban life. Margaret Chen, my father's business partner and the company's chief operating officer, sat at a nearby table, her expression growing increasingly uncomfortable as the speech progressed. I'd always admired Margaret's sharp intellect and no-nonsense approach to business qualities that seemed to irritate my father, despite their professional success together. As Robert continued speaking, detailing the wisdom his sons had supposedly imparted to him over the years, I found myself remembering countless childhood moments that had shaped this family dynamic. While Jake struggled with basic algebra, I'd been accepted into the gifted program and spent weekends competing in academic decathlons. When Connor barely scraped through his undergraduate science courses, I was graduating summa cum laude from Northwestern Law School. Yet every family dinner conversation centered on the boys' potential, their futures, their importance to the Harrison family legacy. The climactic twist that had shaped my entire relationship with my father crystallized in this moment. I wasn't just the most successful of his 3 children. I was arguably more accomplished than he'd ever been. While he'd climbed the corporate ladder through decades of steady advancement, I'd revolutionized legal strategy in mergers and acquisitions, creating innovative approaches that other firms now studied and copied. My client list included Fortune 500 companies, international corporations, and high-profile individuals who sought my expertise specifically. But Robert Harrison had never once acknowledged my achievements because somewhere in his fundamental worldview he believed women belonged in supporting roles, not leadership positions. Success in his mind was measured by traditionally masculine traits, aggression dominance, and the ability to command respect through authority rather than collaboration. My approach to law, which emphasized strategic thinking, emotional intelligence, and building consensus among competing interests, didn't fit his narrow definition of professional excellence. Tonight, watching him credit Jake for teaching him about financial wisdom, while knowing that Jake had nearly bankrupted himself twice through poor investment decisions, and hearing him praise Connor's dedication, while remembering the months Connor had struggled with substance abuse during medical school, I finally understood that my father's opinion had nothing to do with merit, and everything to do with his inability to see women as complete human beings. My father's voice carried across the ballroom with practiced authority as he continued his retirement speech, his words cutting through me like precision instruments designed to inflict maximum damage while maintaining the appearance of familial pride. My son Jake taught me the importance of financial wisdom, Robert declared, gesturing toward my brother with paternal admiration. From the time he was 12 years old, asking thoughtful questions about our family investments, I knew he possessed the analytical mind necessary for true business success. His career on Wall Street has validated everything I believed about the Harrison work ethic and our family's natural aptitude for leadership. The audience murmured appreciatively, many of them unaware that Jake's thoughtful questions as a child had usually been complaints about his allowance being insufficient for the latest video games. His current position at Goldman Sachs had been secured through our father's college roommate, and his recent promotion followed a series of risky trades that had nearly cost his firm millions before market conditions unexpectedly shifted in his favor. Connor demonstrated dedication that inspired my own commitment to excellence. My father continued, his chest swelling with pride as he looked toward my older brother. Watching him pursue medicine, seeing his determination to heal others, reminded me why we must never accept mediocrity in ourselves or our work. His success as a surgeon represents the highest ideals of our family. More applause rippled through the crowd, punctuated by Connor's modest nod and Amanda's adoring smile. The guests couldn't know about the 2 years Connor had spent in rehabilitation or the patient complaints that had nearly ended his career before he'd finally committed to sobriety and intensive therapy. His current success was hard-earned and genuine, but it had come after years of struggle that our father had systematically minimized or ignored. Then Robert's gaze found me, and I felt the familiar chill that preceded his conditional acknowledgments of my existence. "My daughter Beth has always tried her best," he said, his tone shifting to something resembling gentle condescension. "She's worked tremendously hard throughout her education and career, and we're proud of her efforts. However, she's never quite measured up to her brother's natural standards of excellence. Beth tends to rely on collaboration rather than leadership, preferring consensus building over decisive action. These qualities serve her well in her current position, but they demonstrate why some people are born to follow while others are destined to lead." The words landed like physical blows, each syllable crafted to undermine everything I'd accomplished while maintaining plausible deniability. My father had mastered the art of praising with one hand while slapping with the other, ensuring that any objection to his assessment would seem petty or oversensitive. But tonight's humiliation contained a particularly cruel twist that made my stomach clench with recognition and rage. Robert had deliberately scheduled his retirement celebration for the same evening as my law firm's annual gala, where I was supposed to receive recognition for the merger that had established my reputation as one of the most innovative attorneys in corporate law. He'd known about the conflict when he'd chosen the date, and he'd known I would choose his event over my own professional milestone. 6 weeks ago, when the invitations were sent, I'd called to explain the scheduling problem and ask if we might adjust the date by even a few days. Robert had listened to my explanation with the patient silence he reserved for inconvenient requests, then responded that his retirement celebration had been planned for months and couldn't possibly be changed to accommodate my workplace social functions. Family comes first, Beth. He'd said, his voice carrying that familiar tone of disappointment in my priorities. I hope you understand which commitment truly matters. So I declined the gala invitation, missing the opportunity to celebrate my achievement with colleagues who actually valued my contributions. I'd sent my regrets to the managing partners, who'd specifically requested my presence, explaining that I had a prior family obligation. I'd watched David, my boyfriend of 2 years, struggle to hide his frustration at my choice, knowing he'd seen me make similar sacrifices countless times before. And now, sitting in this ballroom listening to my father systematically diminish my accomplishments, while elevating my brother's lesser achievements, I realized that he'd orchestrated this exact scenario. He'd wanted me here tonight, specifically so he could demonstrate in front of everyone who mattered to both of us precisely where I ranked in the Harrison family hierarchy. Looking around the room, I saw faces I recognized from years of community events and family gatherings. Judge Patricia Holbrook, who'd written me a recommendation letter for law school, looked visibly uncomfortable. Dr. Williams, who'd been our family physician since childhood and who'd celebrated my law school graduation with genuine enthusiasm, frowned as he processed my father's backhanded compliments. Even Sarah, my sister-in-law, seemed embarrassed by the obvious disparity in how Robert discussed his children. Margaret Chen's expression had shifted from polite attention to barely concealed anger. As one of the few women in Meridian Industries' executive leadership, she'd undoubtedly recognized the sexist undertones in my father's assessment of my professional style. Her dark eyes met mine across the room, and I saw a flash of solidarity that reminded me I wasn't imagining the cruelty embedded in my father's words. The applause that followed my father's comments about me felt hollow, obligatory rather than enthusiastic. People were clapping because the moment required applause, not because they believed what they'd just heard. But the damage was done, the message delivered with surgical precision to everyone who mattered in our social and professional circles. As the sound washed over me, I felt the weight of the wrapped box in my purse, the corners of the small package pressing against my ribs through the leather. I'd brought it hoping for a different kind of evening, one where I might finally share news that would force my father to see me as the accomplished woman I'd become. Instead, I found myself holding evidence that would change everything between us, knowledge that had been burning inside me for months as I'd struggled with what to do with information that could destroy our family. The climactic realization that crystallized in that moment was this. My father didn't just dismiss my achievements because he was old-fashioned or traditional. He actively resented my success because it challenged his fundamental beliefs about gender power and worth. Tonight wasn't accidental cruelty born from thoughtlessness. It was deliberate humiliation designed to put me back in what he considered my proper place. As the applause continued to ripple through the ballroom, I sat frozen in my chair, my fingers wrapped around the small wrapped box nestled deep in my purse. The weight of it felt disproportionate to its actual size, as if the contents possessed gravitational pull that threatened to drag everything in our family's orbit into chaos. I'd brought the box tonight with entirely different intentions. For weeks, I'd been planning to use this celebration as a moment to finally share news that would fundamentally shift how my father viewed my professional capabilities. Inside the elegant white wrapping paper, beneath the silver ribbon I'd tied with shaking hands this morning, lay documents that represented the pinnacle of my career achievements. 3 separate job offers from Fortune 500 companies had arrived in the past month, each one representing a substantial promotion from my current partnership position. Microsoft wanted me as their general counsel, offering a salary package that exceeded my father's peak earnings by 60%. Tesla had approached me to lead their legal department through their next phase of international expansion, with stock options that could potentially make me wealthy, beyond anything our family had ever imagined. Amazon had extended an invitation to join their executive leadership team, reporting directly to their chief executive officer. But the most significant document in that box was the official notification from Blackstone Morrison and Associates that I'd been selected as the youngest woman in the firm's history to be offered a senior partnership position. The ceremony that was taking place across town right now, the one I'd missed to attend my father's celebration, was meant to announce my elevation to the firm's executive committee. I'd spent hours crafting the perfect way to share this news with my family, imagining my father's face when he realized that his daughter had achieved a level of professional success that surpassed both of my brother's accomplishments. I'd envisioned a moment of recognition, perhaps even pride, that might finally bridge the gap that had existed between us since childhood. The irony of tonight's humiliation was that everything my father had just said about my professional approach was exactly why these companies wanted me. My collaborative leadership style, my ability to build consensus among competing interests, my preference for strategic thinking over aggressive posturing had become increasingly valuable in modern corporate environments. The legal strategies I developed prioritized long-term relationship building and sustainable solutions, approaches that generated more lasting success than the traditional adversarial methods my father's generation favored. But there was something else in that box, something I'd discovered 6 months ago that had transformed my entire relationship with my family's financial stability and my father's professional reputation. Hidden beneath the job offers and partnership documents was a manila envelope containing photocopies of financial records that had accidentally crossed my desk during an unrelated case. My law firm had been retained to provide due diligence for a company considering an acquisition of one of Meridian Industries' subsidiaries. As part of my research into their financial structure, I'd gained access to accounting records that revealed discrepancies I couldn't ignore. At first, I'd assumed the irregularities were bookkeeping errors or legitimate business expenses that had been miscategorized. Then, I'd started recognizing patterns that made my legal training and financial expertise sound internal alarms. Large payments to consulting companies that didn't seem to provide any actual services. Vendor contracts with organizations that existed only on paper. Most troubling of all, I discovered that substantial sums from these questionable transactions had been transferred into investment accounts belonging to my brother Jake. The climactic twist that had been eating away at me for months was the realization that my father had been systematically embezzling money from Meridian Industries for over 8 years. The scheme was sophisticated, involving fake vendor relationships and consulting contracts that funneled company funds through a network of shell companies before the money eventually reached accounts that my father controlled or influenced. Jake's investment success, the foundation of the financial wisdom my father had just praised publicly, was built entirely on stolen money. The returns that had made Jake look like a prodigy on Wall Street came from investments funded by embezzled corporate assets. Every promotion, every professional accolade, every moment of paternal pride that Jake had received was contaminated by criminal activity. The knowledge had been destroying me, slowly creating an impossible ethical dilemma that grew more complex. Each day I delayed action. As an attorney, I had professional obligations to report suspected criminal activity. As a daughter, I struggled with the implications of destroying my family by exposing my father's crimes. As a sister, I wrestled with the knowledge that Jake's career would be obliterated if the truth emerged, regardless of whether he'd been aware of the money's criminal origins. For months, I'd been hoping to find evidence that might exonerate my father or explain the discrepancies through legitimate means. I'd wanted desperately to believe that my legal training had led me to incorrect conclusions, that there was some explanation that would preserve my family's integrity and my father's reputation. Instead, the more I'd investigated, the more damning the evidence had become. The embezzlement scheme was extensive, sophisticated, and absolutely undeniable. My father hadn't just stolen money from his own company. He'd built an elaborate system for laundering those funds through investments that made his sons look successful, while female colleagues like Margaret Chen struggled against artificial barriers to their advancement. Tonight, listening to him publicly diminish my achievements while celebrating accomplishments that were funded by criminal activity, I felt something fundamental shift in my chest. The box in my purse no longer represented an opportunity to share good news with my family. It had become a weapon loaded with information that would either force my father to confront his treatment of me or expose the rot at the foundation of everything he'd built. Sitting in that ballroom surrounded by 300 people applauding words designed to humiliate me, I realized that I was done protecting a man who'd never protected me. I was done prioritizing family loyalty over personal dignity. I was done enabling a system that celebrated stolen success while dismissing genuine achievement. The decision crystallized with perfect clarity. My father was about to learn that his biggest failure wasn't raising a daughter who lacked what it takes. His biggest failure was underestimating exactly what his daughter was capable of when pushed too far. The applause began to fade as my father stepped back from the podium, his satisfied smile suggesting he believed his speech had achieved its intended effect. Around me, guests were reaching for their wine glasses and turning toward neighbors to murmur polite responses to what they'd just witnessed. The soft jazz ensemble in the corner prepared to resume their background melodies, signaling the transition from formal remarks to social mingling. But instead of settling back into my chair to endure the rest of the evening's festivities, I stood. The movement felt both inevitable and surreal, as if I were watching someone else's body rise from the white linen-draped table while my consciousness observed from a distance. Every nerve ending in my body hummed with adrenaline, yet my thoughts had achieved a crystalline clarity I'd never experienced before. 28 years of accumulated hurt, disappointment, and suppressed anger coalesced into a single moment of absolute certainty about what needed to happen next. My chair scraped softly against the marble floor, the sound somehow audible despite the ambient conversation filling the ballroom. Linda's head snapped toward me, her pearl earrings catching the chandelier light as her eyes widened with maternal alarm. She'd seen this expression on my face before during childhood moments when I'd finally reached my limit with unfair treatment and prepared to fight back regardless of consequences. "Beth," she whispered urgently, her manicured fingers reaching toward my wrist in an attempt to guide me back to my seat. "Please, honey, not tonight." But I was already moving my midnight blue heels clicking against the polished floor with measured precision. The box in my purse felt lighter now, as if the decision to act had somehow altered its physical properties. My hands remained steady, my breathing controlled my facial expression carefully neutral as I navigated between tables filled with family friends and business associates who were beginning to notice my purposeful progress toward the front of the room. At the Harrison family table, Jake's confident demeanor faltered as he registered my movement. His investment banker instincts, honed through years of reading corporate power dynamics, recognized something dangerous in my deliberate approach to the podium. Sarah grabbed his arm, her diamond bracelet flashing as she tried to get his attention with urgent whispers about whatever was happening. Connor's medical training kicked in automatically, his surgeon's mind cataloging potential crisis indicators as he watched his sister's face for clues about her intentions. Amanda leaned forward, her social worker background allowing her to sense emotional undercurrents that the other guests were still missing. Both of my brothers began to rise from their seats, some instinct warning them that intervention might be necessary. but it was my father's reaction that confirmed I'd made the right choice. The moment Robert saw me standing walking toward him with unmistakable purpose, his triumphant expression dissolved into something approaching panic. His eyes darted from my face to the purse clutched in my left hand, then back to my eyes with a recognition that made my stomach clench. He knew. Somehow, despite my months of careful investigation and discreet inquiries, my father had sensed that I'd discovered something that threatened him. Perhaps it was the legal training that had taught me to ask precisely the right questions. Or maybe it was the way I'd been looking at him differently during recent family gatherings. Whatever had triggered his suspicion, Robert Harrison was watching me approach with the expression of a man who understood that his carefully constructed world was about to collapse. The ballroom gradually fell silent as more guests noticed the unusual drama unfolding before them. Conversations tapered off in rippling waves, starting from tables closest to my path and spreading outward as people turned to see what was capturing everyone's attention. By the time I'd covered half the distance to the podium, 300 people were watching in fascinated silence. Margaret Chen's table had gone completely quiet, her business partners and their spouses sensing professional implications in whatever confrontation was developing. Judge Holbrook set down her wine glass, her judicial instincts recognizing the gravity of whatever was about to unfold. Dr. Williams leaned forward, concern creasing his features as he watched a family dynamic he'd observed for decades reach some kind of critical breaking point. My father's hands were trembling slightly as he gripped the podium's edges, his knuckles white against the dark wood. The microphone was still live, which meant every word of our upcoming conversation would be broadcast to the entire gathering. He seemed frozen between the desire to flee and the social obligation to maintain composure in front of his professional and personal communities. "Beth," he said, his voice carrying it across the ballroom's sound system, with forced joviality that couldn't quite mask his underlying anxiety. "What can I do for you, sweetheart?" The term of endearment, which he rarely used and never with genuine affection, sounded hollow in the elegant space. It was the verbal equivalent of his speech's backhanded compliments, an attempt to maintain paternal authority while acknowledging that something had fundamentally shifted in our relationship dynamic. I reached into my purse and withdrew the wrapped box, its white paper pristine and silver ribbon perfectly tied. The package looked innocent enough, the kind of gift that might contain jewelry, a watch, or some other traditional retirement present. But the weight of it in my hands carried the accumulated evidence of years of systematic theft, professional fraud, and family betrayal. As I approached the final few steps to the podium, I could hear my mother's sharp intake of breath behind me, followed by Jake's muttered profanity and Connor's whispered question about what I was doing. The jazz ensemble had stopped playing entirely, their instruments silent as they joined the rest of the crowd in witnessing whatever was about to happen. My father's face had gone pale beneath his country club tan, and I realized with devastating clarity that he'd been expecting this confrontation for months. Perhaps he'd known from the moment he'd seen my name on the legal team handling Meridian Industries' subsidiary review that his crimes would eventually be discovered. Maybe he'd been living with the knowledge that his daughter, the child he'd consistently dismissed and undermined, possessed the professional skills necessary to unravel everything he'd built through fraud and deception. The climactic twist that would define the rest of our relationship was crystallizing in this moment. My father wasn't just afraid of professional consequences or legal prosecution. He was terrified of being exposed by the daughter he'd spent decades convincing everyone was a failure, the child he'd publicly declared would never measure up to her brother's standards. Standing 3 feet from the podium, holding his wrapped destruction in my hands, I realized that Robert Harrison's greatest fear wasn't losing his freedom or his reputation. His greatest fear was that everyone in this room would finally see which of his children possessed real strength, integrity, and the capacity for decisive action when justice demanded it. I extended the wrapped box toward my father with the same ceremonial precision he'd used when presenting awards to employees during his decades of corporate leadership. The white paper caught the ballroom's crystal chandelier, light its pristine surface reflecting the shocked faces of 300 guests, who sensed they were witnessing something far more significant than a simple family exchange. Robert's hands hesitated before accepting the package, his fingers brushing against mine in a moment of contact that felt electric with unspoken tension. Up close, I could see the fine tremor in his grip, the way his breathing had become shallow and controlled. The confident executive who'd commanded this room minutes earlier had been replaced by a man whose carefully constructed facade was cracking under pressure. "Thank you, Beth," he managed to say, his voice still amplified by the microphone he'd forgotten to turn off. The words sounded automated, the social programming of decades, overwhelming his obvious desire to refuse whatever I was offering. I stepped closer to the microphone, close enough that my voice would carry clearly to every corner of the ballroom. The silence was so complete that I could hear my own heartbeat, the soft rustle of fabric as people leaned forward to catch every word, the distant hum of the building's ventilation system. "This is from your biggest failure," I said, my voice steady and clear despite the emotional earthquake happening inside my chest. The words hung in the air like a physical presence, their meaning rippling through the crowd in waves of shock and confusion. I heard my mother's sharp gasp from across the room, followed by what sounded like Sarah's whispered, "Oh my God!" and the scrape of multiple chairs as people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. My father's face went through a series of rapid transformations: confusion, recognition, panic, and finally a kind of desperate calculation as he processed what I'd just said in front of everyone who mattered to his professional and social standing. His fingers tightened around the box as if he could somehow contain whatever truth lay hidden beneath its elegant wrapping. But I was already turning away, my job here finished. I'd spent months agonizing over how to handle what I discovered wrestling with loyalty and ethics and family obligations. Tonight's humiliation had crystallized my decision. With perfect clarity, some betrayals were too fundamental to forgive, some cruelties too deliberate to overlook. My heels clicked against the marble floor with measured cadence as I walked toward the ballroom's main entrance, each step taking me further from the life I'd known and closer to whatever consequences would follow. Behind me, I could hear the beginning of whispered conversations, the sound of my father's nervous clearing of his throat, my mother's urgent, "Robert, what is she talking about?" The walk to the exit felt both endless and instantaneous, as if time had become elastic under the weight of what was happening. Faces blurred past me as I maintained my dignified pace. Judge Holbrook's concerned frown, Margaret Chen's knowing nod, Dr. Williams's expression of growing alarm as he began to suspect that whatever was in that box would have serious implications for everyone involved. Jake's voice cut through the ambient tension. "Beth, wait, what the hell?" But I didn't pause, didn't acknowledge his demand for explanation. Whatever happened next would unfold without my presence, without my participation in the family dynamics that had shaped and constrained my life for 28 years. I could hear my father's voice behind me, still amplified by the live microphone as he tried to regain control of the situation. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for this unexpected family moment. Perhaps we should..." But his words trailed off as the sound of tearing paper reached the microphone. He was opening the box. The exit doors were 20 feet away when I heard the sharp intake of breath that signaled my father had seen the contents. The sound was picked up by the microphone and broadcast to the entire gathering, followed by what could only be described as a strangled noise of recognition and horror. Then came the screaming. It started as a low, anguished sound that built rapidly into something approaching hysteria. The microphone amplified every nuance of my father's breakdown as the documents in that box revealed the full scope of his criminal activity, to his own eyes, perhaps, for the first time organized and presented with the legal precision that made their implications undeniable. The ballroom erupted into chaos behind me. I heard chairs being pushed back, rapidly urgent voices calling for someone to turn off the microphone. My mother's voice rising above the confusion as she demanded to know what was happening. Security personnel were probably moving toward the podium, and I suspected Dr. Williams was already approaching to provide medical assistance if needed. But I kept walking my pace, never faltering as I reached the exit doors. The sounds of my family's disintegration followed me into the lobby, where the evening's valet staff looked startled by the obvious crisis unfolding in their elegant venue. "Miss Harrison," the young man at the valet stand said nervously, "is everything all right? Should we call someone?" "Please bring my car," I replied calmly, handing him my ticket. "The black Tesla Model S." My phone was already buzzing frantically in my purse, text messages and calls flooding in as word spread through the ballroom about what had just occurred. I ignored them all, standing in the country club's opulent lobby while the sounds of my father's public breakdown echoed faintly through the closed ballroom doors. The climactic twist I hadn't fully anticipated was how relief would feel when it finally arrived. For 6 months, I'd carried the weight of knowing about my father's crimes, struggling with impossible choices about family loyalty versus legal ethics. Tonight's humiliation had finally freed me from that burden by making the choice inevitable and absolute. As my Tesla pulled up to the entrance, its sleek lines and electric silence a stark contrast to the chaos I was leaving behind, I realized that my father's screaming wasn't just about the evidence I'd presented. It was the sound of a man who'd finally realized that the daughter he'd dismissed as inadequate possessed the intelligence, resources, and moral courage to destroy everything he'd built through deception and theft. Walking toward my car, I felt lighter than I had in months, as if I'd finally set down a crushing weight I'd been carrying, without realizing how much it had been limiting my ability to move forward. Whatever happened next, I was done enabling a man who'd never respected me, done protecting someone who'd never protected me, and done accepting a place in a family hierarchy built on lies and stolen success. My Tesla glided silently through the suburban streets of our upscale neighborhood, its electric motor providing a stark contrast to the emotional turbulence churning in my chest. The dashboard's soft blue glow illuminated my hands as they gripped the steering wheel steady, despite the adrenaline still coursing through my system. Behind me, the Riverside Country Club's elegant facade grew smaller in my rearview mirror, but the chaos I'd left in that ballroom felt like it was expanding to fill every space in my consciousness. My phone connected to the car's sound system had been ringing continuously since I'd cleared the country club's circular driveway. The caller ID displayed a rotating sequence of family members and close friends who'd witnessed my confrontation with my father. I let each call go to voicemail, needing distance and silence to process what I'd just set in motion. The familiar landmarks of my childhood seemed different now, as if my decision to expose my father's crimes had somehow altered the fundamental nature of the world I'd known. The stately homes with their manicured lawns and 3-car garages represented a lifestyle built on professional success and financial stability values I'd thought my family embodied until I'd discovered the criminal foundation underlying our prosperity. When I finally answered my phone, it was my mother's trembling voice that filled the car's interior. "Beth, sweetheart, you need to come back." Linda said, her words rushing together in a way that suggested she'd been crying. "Your father, something's wrong with him. Dr. Williams thinks he might be having some kind of breakdown. Security had to help him to a private room, and he keeps asking for his lawyer." I pulled into my apartment building's underground garage, the concrete walls muffling the sound of my mother's distress. What did he say when he saw what was in the box? "He wouldn't tell me," Linda replied, frustration and fear competing in her voice. He just kept saying that you didn't understand, that you'd ruined everything. Beth, what was in that package? What could possibly be so terrible that it would cause him to react like this? The weight of my mother's questions settled over me as I rode the elevator to my 30th floor apartment. Linda Harrison had spent decades managing my father's moods and protecting his reputation, often at the expense of her own needs and desires. She'd smoothed over his harsh treatment of me, rationalized his favoritism toward my brothers, and maintained the perfect facade of family harmony that had made the Harrisons a respected fixture in our community's social landscape. Now I was about to shatter her understanding of the man she'd been married to for 32 years. "Mom," I said gently, unlocking my apartment door and stepping into the sanctuary I'd created away from family expectations and obligations. "Dad has been stealing money from Meridian Industries for the past 8 years. The box contained financial documents that prove he's embezzled millions of dollars and used Jake's investment accounts to launder the stolen funds." The silence that followed my revelation was so complete that I wondered if the call had been disconnected. My apartment's floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city's glittering skyline, a vista that had always provided perspective during difficult moments in my legal career. Tonight, those lights seemed to represent the thousands of people going about their normal lives, unaware that the Harrison family's carefully constructed world was imploding 20 miles away. "That's impossible," Linda finally whispered, but her voice carried no conviction. "Your father would never. He's always been so ethical, so careful about following rules." "I found the evidence while working on an unrelated case," I explained, settling into my favorite armchair and looking out at the city below. "The documentation is extensive, Mom. Bank records, fake vendor contracts, wire transfer receipts. Jake's entire investment portfolio is funded by stolen corporate assets." Another long pause, followed by the sound of my mother's sharp intake of breath as the implications began to crystallize. "Jake doesn't know." "I don't think so," I replied honestly, "but his ignorance won't protect him when federal investigators start examining where his investment capital came from. His career on Wall Street is finished regardless of whether he was complicit or just willfully blind to obvious warning signs." The climactic twist that I hadn't fully considered until this moment was how my revelation would devastate my mother's entire understanding of her life and marriage. Linda had sacrificed her own career aspirations to support what she'd believed was my father's legitimate professional success. She'd endured his condescending treatment of me because she'd thought his achievements justified his arrogance. She'd enabled his favoritism toward my brothers because she'd accepted his assessment that they possessed superior capabilities. Now she was learning that everything she defended, everything she'd sacrificed for, had been built on criminal activity that would destroy the family she'd spent decades trying to hold together. "Beth," my mother said, her voice breaking completely, "why didn't you come to me first? Why didn't you give us a chance to handle this privately as a family?" The question hit me like a physical blow, not because it was unfair, but because it revealed how completely my mother had internalized the family dynamic that had always prioritized my father's comfort over everyone else's well-being. Even now, learning about criminal activity that had funded our lifestyle and my brother's careers, her first instinct was to protect the man who'd orchestrated the deception. "Because he humiliated me publicly tonight," I said, my voice harder than I'd intended. "Because after 28 years of being dismissed, overlooked, and treated like a disappointment, I watched him praise achievements that were funded by stolen money while declaring that I'd never have what it takes to succeed." Through my apartment's windows, I could see the lights of other buildings where families were probably sitting down to normal Sunday dinners, discussing work schedules and weekend plans without the weight of criminal investigations and federal prosecutions hanging over their conversations. Your father loves you, Linda said desperately. He's always been proud of you, even if he doesn't express it the way you'd prefer. This will destroy him, Beth. This will destroy all of us. No, I replied firmly, feeling a clarity I'd never experienced before. His crimes will destroy him. His choices, his actions, his decision to steal from his own company and involve Jake in money laundering. I didn't create this situation, Mom. I just stopped protecting him from the consequences of what he'd already done. My phone buzzed with an incoming call from Jake, his name flashing on the screen with urgent persistence. I declined the call, not ready to face my brother's anger or panic about how my revelation would affect his career and reputation. But even as I sat in my apartment surrounded by the professional achievements and personal independence I'd built despite my father's lack of support, I couldn't escape the growing realization that the box I'd handed him tonight would detonate far beyond our family circle. Meridian Industries employed thousands of people whose jobs and pension funds had been compromised by my father's theft. Shareholders who'd trusted the company's leadership would face significant losses when the embezzlement was discovered and prosecuted. The climactic consequence I'd set in motion wasn't just personal revenge against a father who'd never respected me. It was the beginning of a corporate scandal that would ripple through our entire community, affecting innocent people who'd had no role in my family's dysfunction or my father's criminal choices. As my phone continued to buzz with ignored calls and accumulating voicemail messages, I realized that tomorrow would bring consequences none of us had fully prepared for, and that my decision to finally fight back against years of dismissal and humiliation would reshape not just our family, but the lives of everyone connected to the empire my father had built on stolen foundations. My mother called back within minutes, her voice steadier, but carrying an undertone of steel I'd rarely heard from her before. The woman who'd spent decades smoothing over family conflicts and maintaining peaceful facades had apparently reached her own breaking point. Beth, I need you to explain exactly what you found, Linda said without preamble. Not generalities, not accusations. Facts, documentation, evidence. I moved to my home office, a space I designed for late-night legal research and complex case analysis. The walls were lined with law books and professional journals, punctuated by framed diplomas and awards that my father had never bothered to acknowledge. Settling behind my desk, I opened my laptop and pulled up the encrypted files I'd been maintaining since discovering the financial discrepancies 6 months ago. The scheme involves approximately $12 million stolen over 8 years. I began my legal training automatically organizing the evidence in a logical sequence. Dad created shell companies with names similar to legitimate Meridian Industries vendors: Pinnacle Consulting Solutions, Meridian Advisory Services Strategic Development Partners. Each company exists only on paper with bank accounts that Dad controls through false identification documents and forged incorporation papers. Linda's sharp intake of breath suggested she was beginning to understand the sophistication and scope of what her husband had orchestrated. He would approve payments to these fake companies for services they never provided. I continued pulling up bank records on my screen. Consulting fees, advisory services, strategic planning initiatives. The amounts were carefully calculated to stay below the thresholds that would trigger internal audits, usually between $50,000 and $200,000 per transaction. How do you know Jake's accounts are involved? My mother asked, though her voice suggested she was already accepting the devastating truth. Because that's where the money ultimately ended up, I explained, feeling the familiar sick feeling that had plagued me for months whenever I'd reviewed these records. After the funds reached the shell company accounts, they were transferred to investment firms where Jake has accounts. The transfers were structured to look like legitimate investment capital, complete with fabricated documentation about Jake's supposed business ventures and startup investments. The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that I wondered if my mother had hung up. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a flatness that suggested emotional shock. How much money has Jake unknowingly invested from stolen funds? Based on the financial records, I've been able to trace approximately $6.8 million, I replied. His entire portfolio with Goldman Sachs, his real estate investments, even the down payment on his house. All of it funded by money Dad stole from Meridian Industries. Linda's reaction was a sound somewhere between a sob and a laugh, the kind of noise people make when reality becomes too absurd to process normally. And Connor appears to be genuinely uninvolved, I said, feeling relief that at least one of my brothers wouldn't face criminal investigation. His medical school loans were legitimate student debt. His residency salary was documented hospital income, and his current position was earned through standard professional channels. But even as I provided my mother with the factual analysis she'd requested, I couldn't escape the broader implications of what I'd discovered. Jake's success story, the financial wisdom my father had praised publicly tonight, was entirely fabricated. Every promotion, every professional accolade, every moment of paternal pride had been built on criminal activity that would now destroy both of their reputations. The climactic twist that had been eating away at me was the realization that my father hadn't just committed these crimes for personal enrichment. The embezzlement scheme had been designed specifically to elevate Jake's career and validate Robert's belief that his sons possessed superior capabilities. By funneling stolen money through Jake's investment accounts, my father had created artificial evidence of financial acumen that supported his gender-biased assessment of his children's relative worth. "Beth," Linda said finally, "does Jake know? Has he suspected anything about where this money came from?" The question I'd been dreading forced me to confront the moral complexity that had paralyzed me for months. Based on my analysis of email communications and investment records, Jake had asked questions about the origin of his investment capital, particularly during periods when large amounts appeared in his accounts without clear explanations. I think he suspected something was irregular, I admitted reluctantly. There are email exchanges between him and Dad where Jake asks about family business investments and Harrison development opportunities that don't correspond to any legitimate business activities I can identify. So he chose not to investigate further. It appears that way, I replied, hating that I was providing evidence that would devastate my family, but unable to lie about what I discovered. Jake was making exceptional returns on investments that should have been much riskier. His colleagues at Goldman Sachs were treating him like a financial prodigy based on performance that was artificially enhanced by stolen capital. My mother was quiet for a long time, and I could imagine her sitting in the country club's parking lot, or perhaps in her car outside our childhood home, trying to process information that was rewriting 3 decades of marriage and family history. When she spoke again, her voice carried a new quality I'd never heard before, a kind of cold clarity that suggested Linda Harrison was finally seeing her husband and family dynamics without the protective filters she'd maintained for years. "Your father scheduled his retirement party for tonight specifically because he knew you'd choose his event over your law firm's celebration," she said, not asking a question, but stating a fact she'd apparently just realized. "Yes," I confirmed, surprised by her sudden insight into the deliberate cruelty of that scheduling conflict. "He wanted you there so he could diminish your achievements in front of everyone who matters to both of you while celebrating success that he knew was funded by criminal activity." "That's how I see it," I agreed, feeling validated that someone else had recognized the calculated nature of tonight's humiliation. "And when you stood up with that box, he knew exactly what you'd discovered." His reaction certainly suggested recognition, I said, remembering the panic that had flashed across my father's face the moment he'd seen me approaching the podium. Linda's next statement carried the weight of 32 years of marriage finally achieving clarity. "He's been planning to leave the country." The revelation hit me like ice water, sudden and shocking in its implications. "What do you mean?" Last month, he applied for expedited passport renewal. My mother explained, her voice gaining strength as pieces of a larger puzzle began falling into place. He told me it was for a European vacation we'd supposedly take during his retirement, but he's never shown any interest in international travel. And yesterday, I found paperwork in his study about offshore banking services and residency requirements for countries that don't have extradition treaties with the United States. The climactic realization crystallized with devastating clarity. My father hadn't just been embezzling money to fund Jake's career and validate his sexist beliefs about his children's capabilities. He'd been preparing to flee the country with millions in stolen assets, leaving behind the family he'd manipulated and the company he'd defrauded, confident that his reputation for ethical leadership would prevent anyone from investigating financial irregularities until he was safely beyond the reach of American law enforcement. Tonight's confrontation hadn't just exposed his crimes to our family and social community, it had potentially prevented him from escaping prosecution by forcing the evidence into the open before he could implement whatever exit strategy he'd been planning. My mother disconnected the call abruptly after her revelation about the passport and offshore banking documents, leaving me staring at my phone screen in the sudden silence of my apartment. The implications of what she'd just told me reverberated through my consciousness, like aftershocks from an earthquake, reshaping everything I thought I'd understood about my father's motivations and timeline. Within minutes, my phone exploded with incoming calls that I could no longer ignore. Jake's name appeared first, followed immediately by Connor's. Then a number I didn't recognize that my caller ID indicated was from our family's attorney. The voicemail notifications accumulated faster than I could process them, each one representing another fracture spreading through the foundation of our family's existence. I answered Jake's call on the fourth attempt, bracing myself for the conversation I'd been dreading since discovering his unwitting involvement in our father's criminal scheme. "Beth, what the hell did you just do?" Jake's voice exploded from my phone speaker, raw with panic and barely controlled rage. "Mom says you've accused Dad of embezzlement, that you think my investment accounts are somehow involved in criminal activity. This is insane. Do you have any idea what kind of damage you could do to my career with these kinds of accusations?" The irony of his question wasn't lost on me. Jake was worried about damage to a career that had been artificially enhanced by stolen money, concerned about protecting a reputation built on criminal activity he'd chosen not to investigate too closely. "Jake," I said calmly, settling back into my chair and preparing for what would likely be the most difficult conversation we'd ever had. "I've spent 6 months investigating financial records that crossed my desk during a routine legal case. The evidence isn't accusatory or speculative. It's documentary proof of systematic embezzlement and money laundering that directly involves your investment portfolio." "That's impossible," Jake insisted, but I could hear the uncertainty creeping into his voice. Dad might be old-fashioned about some things, but he's never been dishonest about business or money, and my investments are legitimate. I've researched every transaction, analyzed every opportunity, with capital that originated from fake vendor payments to shell companies controlled by our father. I interrupted, opening the files on my laptop screen. "Jake, your Goldman Sachs account shows deposits totaling $6.8 million over the past 4 years. Where did you think that money came from?" The pause that followed my question stretched long enough that I began to wonder if he'd hung up on me. When Jake finally responded, his voice had lost its aggressive edge, replaced by something that sounded like dawning comprehension mixed with terror. "He told me it was family money," Jake said quietly. "Investments in Harrison family businesses, returns from our grandfather's estate, profits from property developments he'd been involved in over the years." I asked questions, Beth. I asked specific questions about the sources. "And what did he tell you?" "That the Harrison family had business interests I wasn't old enough to understand when I was growing up. but that now I was ready to benefit from grandfather's business acumen and dad's careful stewardship of family assets. The explanation was exactly the kind of sophisticated lie I'd expected from a man who'd managed to embezzle $12 million over 8 years without detection. Robert Harrison had crafted a narrative that played into Jake's ego while providing just enough family history to make the story believable. Jake, I said gently, Grandfather Harrison died when Dad was 23 years old. He was a middle school history teacher who left behind a house with a mortgage, a 10-year-old Buick, and about $15,000 in savings. There were no family businesses, no property developments, no Harrison family fortune. The sound Jake made was somewhere between a sob and a curse, the noise of someone whose entire understanding of his own success was disintegrating in real time. This means my whole career, everything I've achieved. Everything you achieved was enhanced by criminal activity. I confirmed feeling terrible about destroying my brother's life, but unable to soften the reality of what had happened. Your analytical skills are genuine, your work ethic is real, but the capital that made you look like a financial prodigy came from stolen corporate assets. My phone beeped with another incoming call from Connor, creating a three-way conversation that immediately filled with overlapping voices and emotional chaos. "What's going on?" Connor demanded his surgeon's training, giving his voice a clarity that cut through Jake's panic. "I've got 20 missed calls, Mom's crying in her car outside the country club, and Dad apparently had some kind of breakdown that required medical intervention. Beth people are saying you accused him of criminal activity in front of 300 guests." "Because he is a criminal," I replied, exhaustion beginning to replace the adrenaline that had sustained me through the evening's confrontation. Connor Dad has been embezzling money from Meridian Industries for 8 years. He's used the stolen funds to artificially enhance Jake's investment portfolio, and based on what Mom just told me, he's been planning to flee the country with millions in stolen assets. Connor's medical background made him process information differently than Jake's emotion-driven responses. I could hear him taking notes, asking clarifying questions about timeline and evidence approaching our family's crisis, with the same methodical analysis he applied to cardiac surgery. "Jake," Connor said after I'd finished explaining what I'd discovered, "did you ever verify the sources of your investment capital through independent channels?" "Why would I?" Jake replied defensively. "It was family money managed by our father, a man who spent 35 years building a reputation for ethical business practices. I trusted him because he's our dad, because everything in our upbringing suggested he was worthy of that trust." The climactic twist in our three-way conversation came when Connor's next question forced all of us to confront the deeper implications of what had been happening in our family. "Beth," Connor said slowly, "if Dad has been planning an escape to a country without extradition treaties, what was his timeline? Was he planning to disappear before or after his retirement celebration?" The question crystallized something I'd been sensing but hadn't fully articulated. My father's panic when he'd seen me approaching the podium hadn't just been fear of exposure. It had been the terror of someone whose carefully planned escape route had been suddenly blocked by circumstances beyond his control. I think tonight was supposed to be his farewell, I realized aloud, one final celebration of his legitimate reputation before disappearing with the stolen money. The retirement party wasn't just about receiving accolades. It was about establishing his last public appearance as a respected businessman before vanishing forever. Jake's voice, when he spoke again, carried a flatness that suggested he was beginning to accept the full scope of what our father had done to our family. "So, when you handed him that box tonight, you didn't just expose his crimes," Jake said. "You trapped him. He can't run now because everyone knows what he's done. He can't maintain his innocent reputation because the evidence is public. And he can't escape prosecution because law enforcement will be watching him from this moment forward." The realization that my split-second decision to confront my father publicly had potentially prevented him from fleeing the country with millions in stolen assets was both satisfying and terrifying. I'd acted out of anger and hurt, seeking justice for years of dismissive treatment. But the consequences of my actions were far more extensive than personal vindication. Our family was about to face federal criminal investigation, public scandal, financial ruin, and the complete destruction of everything we'd believed about ourselves and each other. And it had all started with my refusal to accept one more night of being treated like a failure by a man whose success was built on criminal activity. Monday morning arrived with the relentless precision of sunrise, indifferent to the fact that my family's world had imploded less than 36 hours earlier. I'd managed perhaps 3 hours of fitful sleep, my dreams filled with images of my father's panicked face and the sound of his screaming as he'd opened the box that contained evidence of his crimes. My law firm's offices occupied 12 floors of a glass tower in downtown Chicago, its sleek lines and expensive furnishings representing the kind of professional success I'd achieved despite my family's dysfunction. As I emerged from the elevator onto the 42nd floor, I was immediately aware that something had changed in the atmosphere surrounding my workplace. Conversations stopped abruptly when I appeared colleagues offering the kind of carefully neutral greetings that suggested they'd already heard about Saturday night's events. The legal community in Chicago was smaller and more interconnected than most people realized, and news of a prominent businessman's public breakdown at his own retirement party had apparently spread quickly through professional networks. Sarah Chen, my paralegal and one of the few people at the firm who knew about my family situation, approached my office with a stack of message slips and an expression of barely contained urgency. "Beth," she said quietly, closing my office door behind her, "you need to see the financial news before anyone else talks to you." She handed me a tablet displaying the morning's Wall Street Journal homepage where a breaking news banner announced Meridian Industries stock plunges following anonymous tip about financial irregularities. The article published at 6:30 a.m. detailed how an anonymous source had contacted Meridian Industries' board of directors with allegations of systematic embezzlement involving the company's recently retired chief financial officer. The stock price had opened 37% lower than Friday's closing, wiping out hundreds of millions in market value as investors reacted to news that the company was launching an internal investigation into potential criminal activity. "Bye, Beth," Sarah said gently. "The anonymous tipster sent copies of the same financial documents you've been analyzing for months. Bank records, vendor contracts, wire transfer receipts. Someone with access to the same information you discovered decided to take action." The climactic realization hit me like a physical blow. I wasn't the only person who knew about my father's embezzlement scheme. Someone else had been building a case against him, gathering evidence, and waiting for the right moment to expose his criminal activity. My confrontation on Saturday night had either coincidentally occurred on the same weekend as their planned revelation, or it had somehow triggered them to accelerate their timeline. "Do we know who sent the documents?" I asked, settling behind my desk and trying to process the implications of this unexpected development. The submission was anonymous, but the law firm representing Meridian Industries called this morning. Sarah replied, consulting her notes. "They want to schedule a meeting with you as soon as possible. Apparently, your name appeared on some of the financial documents as the attorney who'd requested access to these records during your work on the Stratton Industries acquisition." My phone rang before I could respond, the caller ID displaying a number I recognized as belonging to Margaret Chen, my father's business partner, and Meridian Industries' chief operating officer. I'd been expecting this call since Saturday night, knowing that Margaret's sharp intellect and no-nonsense approach to business would make her one of the first people to understand the implications of what I'd revealed. "Beth." Margaret's voice was crisp and professional, cutting straight to the heart of the matter. I need to meet with you immediately, not as your father's colleague, but as someone who's been investigating the same financial irregularities you've apparently discovered." The revelation that Margaret had been conducting her own investigation explained the anonymous tip that had reached Meridian's board of directors. As chief operating officer, she would have had access to the same financial records that had crossed my desk, and her professional experience would have made her capable of recognizing the patterns that indicated systematic embezzlement. "How long have you known?" I asked, grateful to finally have someone who could understand the impossible position I'd been in for the past 6 months. "I've suspected irregularities for about 18 months, Margaret replied, "but I needed time to gather enough evidence to present a compelling case to the board without destroying my own credibility if I was wrong. Your father has been very careful to maintain plausible explanations for every questionable transaction." We agreed to meet at a neutral location, a coffee shop equidistant from both our offices, where Margaret could explain what she'd discovered and how my family's crisis intersected with her professional obligations to protect Meridian Industries from further criminal activity. The media attention surrounding the developing scandal was already intense. By the time I left my office for the meeting with Margaret, 3 different business journalists had called requesting interviews about my family's connection to the Meridian Industries investigation. My assistant had fielded calls from reporters who'd somehow learned about Saturday night's confrontation and were trying to piece together a timeline that connected my father's public breakdown with the anonymous tip that had triggered the corporate investigation. Margaret Chen was waiting for me at a corner table in the coffee shop, her usually immaculate appearance slightly frayed around the edges, in a way that suggested she'd been working around the clock since the story broke. As chief operating officer of a company suddenly facing a federal investigation, she was probably dealing with the panicked board members, concerned shareholders, and the complex logistics of conducting business while under intense scrutiny. "Beth," she said without preamble as I sat down across from her, "I want you to know that I've been planning to offer you a position as our general counsel once this investigation concludes, and we've implemented new financial oversight systems." The unexpected job offer was stunning in its timing and implications. Margaret was essentially telling me that she saw my role in exposing my father's crimes as evidence of professional integrity rather than family betrayal, and that she wanted my expertise in helping rebuild Meridian Industries' reputation and financial controls. Though the irony, Margaret continued stirring her coffee with mechanical precision, is that your father has been systematically undermining my authority and credibility within the company for years, specifically because my success threatened his belief that women belonged in supporting roles rather than leadership positions. Her words echoed the themes that had shaped my own relationship with my father, the same gender-based dismissiveness that had culminated in Saturday night's public humiliation. But Margaret's experience added another layer to the story. Robert Harrison hadn't just been embezzling money to fund Jake's career and validate his sexist beliefs. He'd been actively sabotaging the professional advancement of qualified women whose success challenged his worldview. The embezzlement scheme wasn't just about personal enrichment or family favoritism, Margaret explained. It was part of a broader pattern of ensuring that leadership positions at Meridian Industries remained concentrated among men who wouldn't challenge his authority or question his decisions. The climactic twist that emerged from our conversation was the realization that my father's criminal activity had been motivated by more than greed or family loyalty. It had been a systematic attempt to preserve a male-dominated corporate culture that was increasingly at odds with modern business practices and legal requirements for workplace equality. By exposing his crimes, I hadn't just prevented him from escaping with stolen money or artificially enhancing Jake's career. I'd potentially opened the door for fundamental changes in how Meridian Industries operated, changes that would benefit not just me, but other women whose professional advancement had been blocked by my father's discriminatory practices. As Margaret outlined her vision for rebuilding the company's leadership structure and financial oversight systems, I began to understand that Saturday night's confrontation had set in motion consequences far more extensive than personal revenge or family justice. It had become the catalyst for transforming an entire corporate culture and holding accountable a system that had privileged men like my father while systematically disadvantaging qualified women like Margaret and me. Margaret's vision for Meridian Industries' future became clearer as our conversation progressed, revealing layers of strategic planning that she'd been developing long before Saturday night's dramatic revelation. Her offer to make me general counsel wasn't an impulsive response to current events, but rather the culmination of months of careful consideration about how to rebuild the company's leadership structure. I've been documenting your father's discriminatory practices for over 2 years, Margaret explained, pulling out a leather portfolio filled with meticulously organized records. Performance reviews where qualified women received lower ratings despite superior results, budget allocations that consistently favored male-led departments, and promotion decisions that somehow always found reasons to advance less qualified men over more experienced female candidates. The documentation she showed me was devastating in its comprehensiveness. Margaret had approached her investigation with the same methodical precision she applied to corporate operations, creating an irrefutable record of systematic gender discrimination that went far beyond my father's embezzlement activities. Your father didn't just steal money, Beth. She continued, her voice carrying the controlled anger of someone who'd endured years of professional sabotage. He stole opportunities, promotions, and career advancement from every woman at Meridian Industries. The embezzlement scheme was just the most blatant example of his willingness to break rules when they interfered with his personal agenda. As Margaret detailed specific instances of discrimination, I began to understand how my own family experience reflected broader patterns of behavior that had infected an entire corporate environment. The same dismissiveness that had characterized my father's treatment of me had been systematically applied to female employees whose competence threatened his authority. She described how budget proposals from female department heads were subjected to additional scrutiny that male colleagues never faced, how women's ideas were routinely credited to male team members in official reports, and how performance metrics seemed to shift depending on whether they were being applied to male or female employees. The most insidious part, Margaret said, was how he made these practices seem reasonable and professional. He never overtly stated that women were less capable, but he created systems that consistently produced outcomes that supported that conclusion. The sophistication of my father's discriminatory practices explained why Margaret had needed so much time to build a compelling case against him. Unlike obvious harassment or explicit bias, Robert Harrison had constructed subtle barriers that were difficult to challenge individually but created overwhelming disadvantages when viewed collectively. When I learned that you discovered the embezzlement scheme, Margaret continued, I realized we had an opportunity to expose not just the financial crimes, but the broader pattern of discrimination that had enabled them. Your father felt entitled to steal from the company because he'd convinced himself that he deserved more recognition and compensation than he was receiving, despite the fact that much of Meridian's recent success came from initiatives led by women he'd systematically undermined. Margaret's strategic thinking impressed me even as it highlighted the complexity of what we were attempting. Exposing my father's crimes was relatively straightforward. The financial evidence was clear and indisputable, but proving systematic discrimination required connecting dozens of individual incidents into a coherent pattern that demonstrated intentional bias rather than coincidental outcomes. The general counsel position I'm offering you, Margaret explained, involves more than just legal oversight. I want you to lead a comprehensive review of our corporate culture, hiring practices, and promotion procedures. We need someone with your expertise to ensure that what happened under your father's leadership can never happen again. The job offer was both professionally exciting and personally complicated. Accepting the position would mean taking responsibility for reforming the company that had employed my father for 35 years, working directly with colleagues who'd witnessed Saturday night's confrontation and potentially facing ongoing scrutiny as the daughter of the executive whose crimes had triggered a federal investigation. But Margaret's offer also represented something I'd never experienced before: professional recognition from someone who valued my capabilities rather than dismissing them. Unlike my father's conditional acknowledgments, Margaret's assessment of my qualifications was based on documented achievements and demonstrated expertise. There's something else you should know, Margaret said, lowering her voice as the coffee shop filled with lunchtime customers. I've been in contact with federal investigators since Sunday morning. The FBI's white-collar crime division will be interviewing family members of suspects in embezzlement cases, including you and your brothers. The information about federal interviews added another layer of complexity to an already overwhelming situation. As both the person who discovered the evidence and the daughter of the primary suspect, I occupied a unique position that would require careful navigation to avoid conflicts of interest or compromising my family's legal defense. The investigators are particularly interested in your role as the attorney who'd gained access to Meridian's financial records through legitimate legal work, Margaret continued. They want to understand how you recognize the irregularities and what steps you took once you realized what you'd discovered. My decision to confront my father publicly rather than reporting the crimes through official channels had created a complex legal situation that would require expert guidance to resolve. While my actions had prevented him from potentially fleeing the country with stolen assets, they'd also complicated the federal investigation by introducing emotional family dynamics into what should have been a straightforward criminal prosecution. Margaret, I said carefully, accepting your job offer while my father faces federal charges for crimes against your company would create obvious conflicts of interest and potential legal complications. That's why I'm not asking for an immediate decision, she replied. The investigation will take months to complete. The legal proceedings could extend for years, and Meridian Industries will need time to recover from the financial and reputational damage your father's crimes have caused. But when this crisis is resolved, I want you to know that there's a place for you here. The climactic realization that emerged from our conversation was how Margaret had transformed what could have been a devastating corporate scandal into an opportunity for fundamental organizational change. Rather than simply addressing my father's criminal activity, she was using the crisis to examine and reform broader patterns of discrimination that had limited the company's potential and violated both legal requirements and ethical standards. Her vision for Meridian Industries' future involved more than replacing my father with someone else who would maintain existing power structures. She wanted to create an environment where professional advancement was based on merit rather than gender, where diverse perspectives were valued rather than marginalized, and where the kind of systematic bias that had characterized my father's leadership would be impossible to sustain. Beth, Margaret said as we prepared to leave the coffee shop, your father underestimated you for your entire life because he couldn't imagine that someone he dismissed as inadequate might possess the intelligence, resources, and moral courage to hold him accountable for his actions. I don't intend to make the same mistake. The offer of partnership, rather than employment of collaboration, rather than subordination, represented everything my relationship with my father had lacked. Margaret saw my capabilities as assets to be utilized rather than threats to be minimized, and her vision for our professional relationship was based on mutual respect rather than hierarchical dominance. As I walked back to my office, I realized that Saturday night's confrontation had opened doors I'd never imagined possible. By refusing to accept one more evening of dismissive treatment, I'd not only exposed my father's crimes, but also connected with someone who could help me transform my professional disappointments into opportunities for meaningful change. Tuesday morning brought a development that transformed our family crisis from private scandal to federal criminal case. I was reviewing contracts in my office when Sarah Chen knocked urgently on my door, her usually composed demeanor replaced by obvious anxiety. Beth, there are FBI agents in the reception area, she said quietly. They're asking to speak with you about the Meridian Industries investigation. The moment I'd been anticipating since Saturday night had finally arrived. Federal investigators had moved quickly to begin interviewing individuals connected to my father's embezzlement scheme, and my role as both the discovering attorney and the suspect's daughter made me a crucial witness in their developing case. Special Agent Patricia Rodriguez and Special Agent Michael Thompson introduced themselves with the professional courtesy that characterized experienced federal investigators. Agent Rodriguez, a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and graying hair, took the lead in explaining why they needed to speak with me. Ms. Harrison, she began, settling into the chair across from my desk, we understand that you discovered financial irregularities involving Meridian Industries during routine legal work for your firm. We'd like you to walk us through exactly what you found and when you found it. The next 2 hours involved the most detailed recounting of my investigation that I'd provided to anyone, including my family. Agent Rodriguez and Agent Thompson asked precise questions about timeline methodology and documentation, building a comprehensive understanding of how I'd uncovered evidence that had eluded Meridian Industries' internal auditing systems for 8 years. The sophistication of the embezzlement scheme suggests extensive planning and intimate knowledge of corporate financial systems. Agent Thompson observed, your father would have needed detailed understanding of auditing procedures, vendor management protocols, and banking regulations to sustain this level of theft without detection. Their professional assessment confirmed what I'd suspected. During my own investigation, Robert Harrison hadn't stumbled into criminal activity through poor judgment or momentary weakness. He deliberately constructed an elaborate system for stealing from his employer while maintaining plausible deniability and avoiding the oversight mechanisms designed to prevent exactly this kind of fraud. Ms. Harrison, Agent Rodriguez said, consulting her notes, we need to discuss your brother Jake's involvement in what appears to be a money laundering operation. Based on the financial records you've provided, approximately $6.8 million in stolen funds were processed through his investment accounts over the past 4 years. The question I'd been dreading forced me to confront the possibility that Jake's involvement in our father's crimes might have been more extensive than I'd wanted to believe. While I'd convinced myself that my brother had been an unwitting victim of our father's manipulation, the FBI's investigation would examine every transaction, communication, and financial decision with forensic precision. My analysis suggests that Jake suspected the money's origins were questionable, I admitted reluctantly. There are email exchanges where he asks specific questions about the source of his investment capital, but he appears to have accepted our father's explanations without independent verification. Agent Thompson made notes about the email communications, and I realized that Jake's written questions about the money's origins would become evidence in the federal case. His decision to accept our father's fabricated explanations rather than investigating further would likely be characterized as willful ignorance that facilitated money laundering regardless of his emotional motivations for trusting our father. The agents spent considerable time examining the timeline of my discovery and my decision-making process once I'd realized what I'd found. Their questions suggested they were trying to understand why I'd chosen to confront my father publicly rather than reporting the crimes immediately to law enforcement or corporate authorities. The evening of the retirement party, Agent Rodriguez said carefully, "You made a decision to present evidence of criminal activity to your father in a public setting. Can you help us understand what motivated that choice?" The question forced me to articulate something I'd been struggling to explain even to myself. My decision to hand my father that box in front of 300 witnesses hadn't been a calculated legal strategy or a planned exposure of criminal activity. It had been an emotional response to years of accumulated hurt and dismissal, triggered by his public humiliation of me on what was supposed to be a night celebrating family and professional achievement. I wasn't thinking like an attorney when I stood up that night, I explained honestly. I was reacting as a daughter who'd finally reached her limit with being treated as a disappointment by someone whose success was built on criminal activity. The agents exchanged glances that suggested my emotional motivation for exposing the crimes might complicate the federal prosecution, while my actions had prevented my father from potentially fleeing the country with stolen assets. They'd also introduced family dynamics that could be exploited by defense attorneys seeking to characterize the case as a vindictive daughter's attack on her father, rather than legitimate law enforcement action. Ms. Harrison, Agent Thompson said, "We need you to understand that your father's criminal activity extends beyond embezzlement and money laundering. Our investigation has revealed that he's been transferring substantial assets to offshore accounts and researching residency requirements for countries without extradition treaties with the United States." The confirmation of my mother's suspicions about escape planning added new charges to the federal case preparation for flight to avoid prosecution, potential tax evasion through unreported offshore accounts, and conspiracy to defraud the United States government. My father's crimes had escalated far beyond corporate theft into federal offenses that carried decades of potential prison time. The climactic revelation came when Agent Rodriguez showed me surveillance photographs taken at O'Hare International Airport on Friday afternoon, less than 24 hours before his retirement party. "Your father was observed meeting with an individual we've identified as a document forger who specializes in creating false identification papers for wealthy clients seeking to disappear," she explained. "The meeting occurred in the international terminal, suggesting your father was preparing for immediate departure from the country." The photographs were devastating in their implications. While I'd been preparing to attend his retirement celebration, hoping to share news about my professional achievements, my father had been finalizing plans to flee the country with millions in stolen assets. Saturday night's party hadn't been a retirement celebration. It had been his farewell event before disappearing forever. "Based on the evidence we've gathered," Agent Thompson continued, "we believe your father intended to leave the country within 72 hours of his retirement party. Your confrontation on Saturday night prevented him from implementing his escape plan and alerted law enforcement to criminal activity that might otherwise have gone undetected until he'd safely reached a non-extradition country." The realization that my impulsive decision to expose my father's crimes had accidentally prevented a carefully planned escape attempt was both satisfying and terrifying. If I'd chosen to handle the situation differently, approaching him privately, working through family channels, or simply staying quiet about what I'd discovered, Robert Harrison might already be living comfortably in a foreign country while his former colleagues and employees dealt with the financial devastation his theft had caused. "Ms. Harrison," Agent Rodriguez said as the interview concluded, "we want you to know that your role in exposing these crimes will be crucial to our prosecution. Your legal expertise, your access to the financial records, and your decision to prevent your father's escape have made it possible for us to seek justice for everyone who was harmed by his criminal activity." The agents left me with instructions about ongoing cooperation with their investigation warnings, about potential media attention as the case developed, and contact information for federal victim services that could help our family navigate the complex legal and emotional challenges ahead. As I sat alone in my office after their departure, I realized that my relationship with my father had been fundamentally redefined by federal criminal charges that would determine the rest of his life. The man who dismissed me as a failure was now facing decades in prison because his biggest failure had been underestimating the daughter he'd never bothered to understand or respect. The arrest happened at dawn on Thursday morning, exactly 1 week after the retirement party that had changed everything. I learned about it through a phone call from my mother, her voice shaking as she described watching FBI agents escort Robert Harrison from their suburban home in handcuffs, while television news crews recorded every moment from the sidewalk. "They were so professional," Linda said, her words coming in disconnected fragments. "They allowed him to dress properly, they didn't use excessive force, but Beth, seeing your father in handcuffs, knowing that our neighbors and friends are watching this on the morning news. I never imagined our family would face something like this." The federal charges read like a catalog of white-collar criminality: 18 counts of wire fraud, 12 counts of money laundering, 6 counts of conspiracy to defraud the United States, and 2 counts of preparing to flee prosecution. Each charge carried potential prison sentences that could keep my father incarcerated for the rest of his natural life. Jake's arrest followed within hours, federal agents appearing at Goldman Sachs's downtown offices to escort him from the trading floor in full view of his colleagues and clients. The investment firm immediately suspended him, pending the outcome of criminal proceedings, and his professional reputation was destroyed before he'd even been formally charged. The charges against Jake were more limited but equally devastating to his career: conspiracy to commit money laundering, failure to report suspicious financial activity, and structuring transactions to avoid federal reporting requirements. While the prosecution acknowledged that he might not have known the money's criminal origins, his documented questions about the fund's sources and his decision to accept implausible explanations made him legally culpable for facilitating the embezzlement scheme. Sarah called me in tears Wednesday evening, her voice breaking as she described the impact on their marriage and young children. "Beth, I know you had to do what you thought was right, but Jake's facing 20 years in federal prison. Our kids are seeing their father's arrest on television. How are we supposed to explain to a 6-year-old that Daddy might be a criminal?" The conversation with my sister-in-law was one of the most difficult I'd ever had, forcing me to confront the collateral damage that my decision to expose the crimes had inflicted on innocent family members. Sarah had married Jake believing he was a successful investment banker with integrity and strong family values. Now she was facing the possibility of raising their children alone while their father served decades in federal prison. Connor's response to the arrest was characteristically analytical and ethically clear. When he called Thursday afternoon, his voice carried the steady professionalism that made him an excellent surgeon, but also revealed the emotional distance he was maintaining from our family's crisis. "Beth," he said without preamble, "I want you to know that I support what you did. Dad's crimes were extensive, systematic, and deliberate. Jake made choices that facilitated criminal activity regardless of his motivations or level of awareness. You discovered evidence of serious crimes and took action to prevent further harm." His support meant more to me than I could express, particularly since Connor was the only family member who seemed capable of separating the legal and ethical issues from the emotional trauma of seeing our father and brother arrested on federal charges. "I've been reviewing the financial records that the prosecutors have made available to defense attorneys," Connor continued. "The scope of Dad's embezzlement is staggering. He didn't just steal money for personal enrichment or to fund Jake's career. He systematically looted Meridian Industries' resources while employees contributed to pension funds that were being depleted by his criminal activity." The broader impact of my father's crimes was becoming clearer as the investigation progressed. Meridian Industries employed over 8,000 people whose retirement security had been compromised by embezzlement that had drained resources from employee benefit funds. Shareholders had lost hundreds of millions in market value when news of the criminal investigation became public. Vendors and business partners faced potential losses from contracts that might be voided if they were connected to fraudulent activities. The human cost of what my father had done extended far beyond our family's private dysfunction into the lives of thousands of innocent people whose financial security had been damaged by his crimes. Friday morning brought the arraignment hearing where my father and Jake would enter formal pleas to the federal charges. I chose not to attend, unable to face the spectacle of watching them stand before a federal judge, while their defense attorneys argued for a reasonable bail and pre-trial release. Linda attended alone, sitting in the back of the courtroom while reporters filled the public gallery and sketch artists captured images that would appear on evening news broadcasts. She called me afterward, her voice hollow with shock at hearing the charges read aloud in open court. "Your father pleaded not guilty to all charges," she reported mechanically. His attorney argued that he's been a respected member of the community for decades and doesn't represent a flight risk, but the prosecutor showed evidence about the offshore accounts and the meeting with the document forger. The judge set bail at $5 million. Jake's bail hearing was equally dramatic, with prosecutors arguing that his access to sophisticated financial networks and demonstrated willingness to ignore obvious warning signs about money sources made him a danger to the integrity of ongoing investigations. His bail was set at $2 million, an amount that would require liquidating most of his assets to secure release. The climactic twist that emerged during the bail hearings was the revelation that my father's criminal activity had been even more extensive than the initial charges suggested. Federal investigators had discovered evidence of additional embezzlement schemes involving other companies where Robert Harrison had served on boards of directors or provided consulting services. The prosecution believes your father has stolen at least $25 million over the past 15 years. Linda told me, her voice barely above a whisper. They think Meridian Industries was just his largest and most sophisticated operation, but that he's been committing similar crimes against other organizations for most of his adult career. The scope of my father's criminal activity was staggering in its implications for everyone who trusted him with fiduciary responsibilities. Corporate boards, charitable organizations, and investment groups had all been potential targets for systematic theft by someone whose reputation for ethical leadership had provided perfect cover for extensive criminal operations. As I processed this information, I realized that my decision to expose his crimes at Meridian Industries had potentially prevented him from victimizing other organizations and individuals who had no reason to suspect that Robert Harrison was anything other than the respected businessman he appeared to be. The federal investigation was expanding rapidly, with prosecutors coordinating with state authorities in multiple jurisdictions to examine my father's involvement with every organization that had trusted him with financial oversight or strategic guidance. The retirement party that was supposed to celebrate his legitimate professional achievements had instead triggered the largest white-collar criminal investigation in our region's history. Saturday marked 1 week since the evening that had changed everything, and I found myself reflecting on how completely my life and family had been transformed by a single moment of refusing to accept one more night of dismissive treatment. The father who declared that I would never have what it takes to succeed was now facing life in federal prison, because he'd underestimated exactly what his daughter was capable of when pushed beyond her limits. 3 weeks after the arrests, I finally agreed to meet with my mother and Connor at a neutral location where we could begin the difficult process of sorting through the emotional wreckage that criminal proceedings had left in their wake. We chose a small restaurant in a neighboring suburb, far enough from our usual haunts to avoid recognition by reporters or curious acquaintances who'd been following the Harrison family scandal in local media. Linda looked older than her 62 years, the stress of public scrutiny and criminal investigations having carved new lines around her eyes and mouth. She'd lost weight, and her usually immaculate appearance showed signs of the strain she'd been under since learning that her 32-year marriage had been built on systematic criminal activity. "I've filed for divorce," she announced without preamble as we settled into a corner booth. "My attorney says it's necessary to protect whatever assets might survive the federal forfeiture proceedings. But honestly, I'm not sure I could stay married to your father, even if he were somehow acquitted of all charges." Connor nodded approvingly, his medical training having taught him to make difficult decisions based on evidence rather than emotion. "It's the right choice, Mom. Dad's pattern of deception and manipulation wasn't limited to his criminal activities. His treatment of our entire family was based on lies about his own character and values." The conversation that followed was unlike any we'd ever had as a family. Without my father's dominating presence or Jake's defensive deflection of criticism, Linda and Connor were able to examine family dynamics that had been distorted by decades of systematic manipulation and emotional abuse. "I've been thinking about your childhood," Linda said, looking directly at me with an expression of profound regret. "All those times your father dismissed your achievements, all the moments when he made it clear that your brother's potential mattered more than your actual accomplishments. I told myself he was just old-fashioned, that his generation expressed pride differently, but I was enabling behavior that was fundamentally harmful and wrong." Her acknowledgement of patterns I'd experienced, but never seen validated, was both healing and painful. For 28 years, I'd questioned my own perceptions of family favoritism and gender-based discrimination, wondering if I was being oversensitive or misinterpreting my father's intentions. Hearing my mother finally recognize and name the systematic unfairness I'd endured was liberating in ways I hadn't expected. "Mom," I said gently, "you were living with the same manipulative behavior that shaped my childhood. Dad was an expert at making his preferences and prejudices seem reasonable and justified. He convinced all of us that his assessment of our relative worth was objective rather than biased." Connor's perspective as the brother who'd benefited from our father's favoritism added another layer to our family reckoning. "I always knew Dad treated you differently, Beth," he admitted, his voice carrying the weight of years of suppressed guilt. "I told myself it was because you were younger or because he related better to sons, but I knew his behavior was unfair, and I chose not to challenge it because confronting him would have cost me his approval." The climactic revelation in our conversation came when Connor acknowledged that he'd been afraid to defend me because he'd recognized, even as a child, that our father's love and approval were conditional on meeting his expectations about gender roles and family hierarchy. "I watched Dad systematically undermine your confidence and dismiss your achievements," Connor continued, "and I said nothing, because I was terrified that defending you would make him turn that same criticism and rejection toward me. I chose my own comfort over your well-being, and I've been ashamed of that cowardice for years." His honesty about the fear that had prevented him from intervening during my childhood helped me understand how thoroughly our father had manipulated all of us. Robert Harrison hadn't just been prejudiced against daughters. He'd been a masterful emotional manipulator who'd used conditional love and approval to control his entire family's behavior. The night of the retirement party, Connor said, "When I watched you walk to that podium with purpose and dignity, despite everything Dad had just said about you, I realized I was seeing the strength and courage I should have shown years ago. You did what I'd been too afraid to do. You refused to accept his treatment and held him accountable for his actions." Linda's transformation during the weeks following my father's arrest had been remarkable to witness. The timid woman who'd spent decades managing his moods and protecting his reputation had been replaced by someone who was finally examining their relationship with clarity and determination. I've started seeing a therapist who specializes in families affected by financial crimes, she told us. She's helping me understand how your father's need to control and dominate extended beyond his criminal activities into every aspect of our family life. The embezzlement wasn't separate from his treatment of you, Beth. It was part of the same pattern of believing that rules and ethical standards didn't apply to him. The therapeutic insight that my father's criminal behavior and his systematic mistreatment of me were expressions of the same underlying character flaws helped explain why exposing his embezzlement had felt like such a profound act of self-defense. His theft from Meridian Industries and his emotional abuse of his daughter both reflected a fundamental belief that he was entitled to take whatever he wanted from people who were less powerful than he was. I've also been meeting with other women whose husbands have been convicted of white-collar crimes, Linda continued. There's a support group for families dealing with federal prosecutions, and I'm learning how common it is for men who commit financial crimes to also be emotionally abusive to their families. Our conversation lasted for hours, covering decades of family history that we were finally able to examine without fear of my father's defensive anger or retaliatory emotional punishment. For the first time in any of our lives, we could speak honestly about patterns of favoritism, discrimination, and manipulation that had shaped our relationships with each other and our understanding of our own worth. As we prepared to leave the restaurant, Connor made a statement that captured the strange mixture of tragedy and liberation that characterized our family's current situation. Dad's arrest has been devastating for our family's reputation and financial security, he said, but it's also freed us to become the people we might have been if we hadn't spent our lives trying to earn approval from someone who was fundamentally incapable of offering genuine love or respect. The realization that my father's imprisonment might actually improve our family dynamics was both sad and hopeful. While none of us had wanted to see him face criminal prosecution, his removal from our daily lives had created space for honesty, growth, and healing that had been impossible while we were all still trying to navigate his demands and expectations. Walking to our cars in the restaurant's parking lot, I felt something I'd rarely experienced in family relationships, the possibility that Linda, Connor, and I might actually be able to build authentic connections based on mutual respect rather than shared submission to my father's authority and judgment. 2 months after the federal arrest, Margaret Chen's phone call came on a Tuesday morning that had started like any other. I was reviewing merger documents when her name appeared on my caller ID, and something in her tone immediately suggested that this conversation would be different from our previous discussions about Meridian Industries' recovery efforts. Beth, she said, her voice carrying barely contained excitement. The board of directors met in emergency session yesterday evening. We've reached unanimous agreement about the general counsel position, and we'd like to offer it to you immediately with some modifications that I think you'll find very appealing. The formal job offer that followed exceeded every expectation I developed during our earlier conversations. The position included not just legal oversight responsibilities, but also authority to lead a comprehensive review of corporate culture, hiring practices, and promotion procedures throughout the entire organization. My compensation package included base salary that was 40% higher than my current partnership income, plus performance bonuses and stock options that could potentially make me wealthy beyond anything I'd previously imagined. The board recognizes that your expertise extends beyond legal matters, Margaret explained. We want you to implement systems that will ensure the kind of discrimination and financial manipulation that characterize your father's leadership can never happen again at Meridian Industries. More than the financial benefits, the scope of authority they were offering represented something I'd never experienced: professional respect and recognition that matched my actual capabilities, rather than diminished expectations based on gender bias. Margaret and the board weren't just hiring me to fill a legal position. They were entrusting me with responsibility for transforming the fundamental culture of an organization that employed 8,000 people. "There's something else," Margaret continued, and I could hear the satisfaction in her voice. "The federal investigation has revealed that several other companies in our industry have been victimized by similar embezzlement schemes. The Department of Justice is establishing a task force to examine patterns of financial crime in corporate America, and they've asked Meridian Industries to serve as a model for how companies can recover from this kind of criminal activity." The opportunity to help shape federal policy regarding corporate crime prevention was both professionally exciting and personally meaningful. My discovery of my father's embezzlement hadn't just exposed criminal activity at one company. It had contributed to a broader understanding of how white-collar criminals operated and what systems were needed to detect and prevent similar crimes. "The media attention surrounding our case has been intense," Margaret acknowledged, "but it's also created opportunities for leadership and influence that extend far beyond Meridian Industries. Business schools are asking us to speak about corporate governance and ethical leadership. Legal conferences want presentations about detecting financial crimes. Professional organizations are seeking guidance about implementing oversight systems that can prevent embezzlement." My decision to accept the position was immediate and unequivocal. After 28 years of seeking recognition that never came from my father, I was being offered professional opportunities that exceeded anything I could have achieved while trying to prove myself worthy of his approval. The announcement of my appointment as general counsel generated substantial media coverage, most of it focusing on the ironic justice of Robert Harrison's daughter, taking responsibility for reforming the company he'd nearly destroyed through criminal activity. Business journalists wrote articles about my legal expertise and strategic vision for corporate governance reform. Legal publications featured interviews about my approach to preventing financial crimes and building ethical organizational cultures. One interview that particularly satisfied me appeared in the Wall Street Journal, where I was able to articulate my vision for how companies could create systems that prevented both financial crimes and the kind of systematic discrimination that had enabled my father's criminal behavior. Corporate cultures that exclude or marginalize qualified women create environments where unethical behavior can flourish unchecked, I explained to the reporter. When leadership positions are concentrated among men who share similar worldviews and protect each other's interests, the oversight mechanisms that should prevent criminal activity become less effective. The article's headline read, "Harrison Daughter Leads Corporate Reform After Father's Embezzlement Conviction," and it captured exactly the kind of professional recognition I'd been seeking throughout my career. Instead of being identified as Robert Harrison's disappointing daughter, I was being recognized as Beth Harrison, corporate reform leader and legal expert whose insights were shaping federal policy discussions. My first day at Meridian Industries was both symbolically powerful and practically productive. Margaret had arranged for me to occupy the corner office that had belonged to my father during his tenure as chief financial officer, complete with the mahogany desk where he'd signed the documents that had facilitated his embezzlement scheme. "I thought you might appreciate the irony of it," Margaret said, as she showed me around the space that had been completely renovated since my father's arrest. The office where he planned and executed his crimes is now the headquarters for preventing similar criminal activity in the future. The justice of that arrangement was deeply satisfying. Every day I would sit at the desk where my father had signed fraudulent vendor contracts, and authorized wire transfers to shell companies using the same space to build systems that would protect other organizations from the kind of systematic theft he'd perpetrated. My team included attorneys, investigators, and corporate governance specialists who'd been recruited specifically for their expertise in detecting and preventing white-collar crimes. Together, we were developing oversight protocols that other companies could adopt, creating educational materials for corporate boards and executive leadership, and establishing reporting mechanisms that would make it much more difficult for future embezzlement schemes to operate undetected. The climactic recognition came 6 months after I'd started the position, when the Department of Justice invited me to testify before a congressional subcommittee examining corporate crime prevention. Standing in the witness chair in a Senate hearing room, providing expert testimony about financial crime detection and prevention, I realized that my father's greatest failure had become the foundation for my greatest professional success. Ms. Harrison, the subcommittee chair asked during my testimony, how did your personal experience with corporate financial crimes influence your approach to developing prevention systems? Senator, I replied, looking directly at the cameras that were broadcasting the hearing nationally, discovering that my own father had been systematically stealing from his employer, taught me that criminal activity can be hidden behind facades of respectability and ethical leadership. The most dangerous white-collar criminals are often the people who seem most trustworthy and professional. As I provided detailed testimony about the sophisticated methods my father had used to embezzle millions while maintaining his reputation for integrity, I realized that his systematic dismissal of my capabilities had prepared me perfectly for this moment. Years of analyzing complex legal problems while receiving no recognition for my expertise had developed skills that were now being applied to some of the most important corporate governance challenges facing American business. The woman he'd declared would never have what it takes to succeed was now testifying before Congress about how to prevent the kind of criminal activity he'd spent decades perfecting. The daughter he'd considered his biggest failure was being recognized as a national expert on corporate ethics and financial crime prevention. 6 months later, as autumn painted Chicago's skyline in brilliant oranges and golds, I stood in my corner office at Meridian Industries, watching the sunset reflect off the windows of downtown buildings where thousands of people were finishing their workdays. The view from the 48th floor encompassed the entire metropolitan area, including the suburban country club where my father's retirement party had taken place and set everything in motion. The transformation of both my personal life and professional circumstances had been so complete that sometimes I struggled to recognize the woman who'd sat at that family table 8 months ago, listening to her father publicly dismiss her achievements while secretly planning to flee the country with millions in stolen assets. Robert Harrison had been sentenced to 18 years in federal prison after pleading guilty to reduced charges in exchange for cooperation with ongoing investigations into corporate financial crimes. Jake received a 5-year sentence for money laundering and conspiracy, though his cooperation with federal prosecutors and genuine remorse for his role in the embezzlement scheme had resulted in a lighter punishment than originally anticipated. The federal investigation had ultimately revealed that my father's criminal activities extended across 15 different organizations over 23 years, with total theft exceeding $47 million. His cooperation with prosecutors had led to the recovery of substantial assets and the exposure of other white-collar criminals who'd been operating similar schemes. Linda had completed her divorce proceedings and used her settlement to establish a foundation that provided support services for families affected by white-collar crime. Her transformation from enabler of my father's abusive behavior to advocate for other women in similar situations had been remarkable to witness and personally healing for our relationship. I spent 32 years making excuses for behavior I knew was wrong. she'd told me during one of our weekly lunch meetings. Now, I'm trying to help other women recognize the warning signs I chose to ignore and find the courage to act on their concerns before their families are destroyed by criminal activity. Connor had emerged from the family scandal with his medical career intact and his personal relationships stronger than ever. His decision to publicly support my actions and cooperate fully with federal investigators had enhanced his reputation for integrity and ethical leadership within the medical community. "The night you confronted Dad at that retirement party," he'd said during a recent family dinner, "I realized I was watching someone demonstrate the kind of moral courage I'd always admired but never thought I possessed. You showed me what it looks like to do the right thing, even when it's personally costly and emotionally devastating." My work at Meridian Industries had expanded beyond corporate governance and financial crime prevention into broader issues of workplace equity and organizational culture reform. The systems we developed for detecting and preventing embezzlement had been adopted by dozens of other companies, and our approach to promoting gender equality in corporate leadership had become a model studied by business schools and professional organizations. The most satisfying aspect of my new role was mentoring young women attorneys and business professionals who were navigating the same kinds of systematic bias and discrimination that had characterized my own early career. Creating opportunities for others that I'd never had myself felt like the most meaningful application of the platform I'd gained through exposing my father's crimes. "The most important thing I've learned," I told a group of female law students during a recent speaking engagement, "is that seeking approval from people who are fundamentally unable to recognize your worth will always be a losing proposition. Real success comes from using your talents to create positive change and surrounding yourself with people who value your contributions." The scholarship fund I'd established at Northwestern Law School specifically supported women from families affected by white-collar crime, recognizing that financial scandals often had devastating effects on children who had no role in their parents' criminal activities but faced significant barriers to educational advancement as a result of family notoriety and reduced financial resources. My relationship with David had deepened into something approaching the kind of partnership I'd always hoped for, but never experienced. His unwavering support during the federal investigation and media scrutiny had demonstrated the difference between conditional acceptance and genuine love. "I've never been prouder of anyone than I was of you that night," he'd told me recently. "Watching you stand up to someone who'd spent your entire life trying to diminish your sense of your own worth, knowing that you were risking everything to do what was right. That's when I knew I wanted to spend my life with someone who has that kind of integrity and courage." The engagement ring he'd given me the previous month was beautiful, but more meaningful was his understanding that our wedding would include my mother and Connor while conspicuously excluding the father and brother, whose criminal activities had made such celebration complicated. David had never known my father as anything other than a federal criminal, which made it easier for him to understand why I felt no obligation to maintain relationships with people who'd never truly valued me. As I prepared to leave the office that evening, Margaret knocked on my door with a final piece of news that seemed to perfectly capture how completely my life had changed. "Beth," she said, settling into the chair across from my desk with an expression of barely contained excitement, "the Harvard Business School just called. They want to offer you a visiting professorship to develop their new curriculum on corporate ethics and financial crime prevention. It's a 2-year position that would allow you to shape how the next generation of business leaders thinks about these issues." The opportunity to influence business education at one of the most prestigious institutions in the world represented recognition that exceeded anything I could have imagined when I was sitting in that ballroom, listening to my father's dismissive assessment of my capabilities. But more than professional validation, the offer represented something deeper, The realization that my father's greatest failure hadn't been raising a daughter who lacked what it took to succeed. His greatest failure had been his inability to recognize that the child he'd systematically dismissed possessed exactly the qualities that would ultimately hold him accountable for his criminal behavior and transform his crimes into opportunities for meaningful social change. As I gathered my belongings and prepared to head home to David and the life we were building together, I reflected on the profound truth that had emerged from 8 months of family crisis and professional transformation. True success isn't about proving yourself to people who refuse to see your worth. It's about using your talents and integrity to create positive change in the world, regardless of whether the people who should have supported you are capable of recognizing your achievements. The daughter Robert Harrison had considered his biggest failure had become a woman whose work was protecting thousands of employees from the kind of criminal activity he'd perfected, whose expertise was shaping federal policy on corporate governance, and whose example was inspiring other women to refuse accepting treatment that diminished their sense of their own capabilities and worth. Standing at my office window, looking out at a city where I'd built a career and a life that honored my actual values, rather than seeking approval from someone whose judgment was compromised by criminal behavior and systematic bias, I realized that the best revenge against a parent who'd never believed in me wasn't professional success or public recognition. The best revenge was building a life so authentically aligned with my principles and so genuinely fulfilling that his opinion of me had become completely irrelevant to my sense of my own worth. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where someone you trusted turned out to be completely different from who you thought they were? How did you handle the choice between family loyalty and doing what was right? I'd love to hear your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please hit the like button to support more content about standing up for yourself and doing the right thing even when it's difficult. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories about family dynamics, workplace challenges, and finding the courage to fight back against unfair treatment. And please share this video with anyone who might need to hear that their worth isn't determined by whether the people who should support them are actually capable of recognizing their value and achievements. Thank you for listening to my story, and I hope it reminds you that sometimes the most painful experiences in our lives can become the foundation for our greatest growth and most meaningful contributions to the world.